Okay, so this is the seventh video lecture. I knew this one would be long. On the topic of race, this was the slide that I ended on, and I left off, and I said I wanted to come back to it to wrap it up. But so we were talking about functional theory, and you'll remember functional theory says that racism serves a purpose. Conflict theory argues that it's about competition between groups. That the powerful group is the one that sort of perpetuates the messaging perpetuates the messaging of racist ideas because it benefits them. This was the one right here. It maintains an internal colonization, and what that really means is an internal colony is where a group of people are used, or we call a split labor market. So it means that certain positions go to people of a certain group, and other positions go to people of another group. And so this is sort of the idea. A really good example is migrant workers, or migrant farm workers, how they're overwhelmingly people of color. But also during like the Second World War, actually, manufacturing companies would go down to the Mexican border and they would recruit Mexican workers and bring them into the United States because there were not enough workers to work in the factories. But as soon as the Second World War was over, they wanted them to leave. Well, as long as we hold on to these racist ideas about groups of people, that they're not American citizens or that the way they got here was not acceptable, then we can basically hire them and put them in jobs when we want to, when the economy demands it. And after that fact, we can send them home. So that's what an internal colony is, that different people are used for different reasons, that we use immigrant workers, we use their labor. That's their natural resource. The idea of race as a caste is, the book that I'm reading is called Caste, is the notion that if you think about, in a previous lecture, I hope I talked about it, the caste is a social rank that's determined at your birth. And race can very much be conceived that because you can't really change your race, I mean, Michael Jackson tried, because in our culture, race is defined by the color of your skin. You are born, right, looking like that. You can't change it. And because we have defined racial groups based on the color of our skin, and because the color of our skin aligns us with certain experiences, certain occupations, it influences or defines where we're supposed to live, who we're supposed to marry, what kind of these kinds of things, it can conceivably be thought of as a caste, because the caste system of India was determined at birth, influenced where you lived, influenced your occupations, and stayed with you for the rest of your life. That model, to me, makes some sense. Some other ways of thinking about race, from a symbolic interactionist perspective, you remember symbolic interactionism is really about micro, and this doesn't necessarily explain racism per se, it just really offers some ways of thinking about the way people, quote unquote, do race. So the idea here is that race is not about what one looks like, but it's about the way people act. So the way a person dresses, the music they listen to, the way they talk. Right. So from that context, my story about Antoine, right, when he talks white, that's doing race, right? He's doing white. So if he dresses like a white person, if he talks like a white person, from this model, from this idea, he's doing white. The same thing can be said if, a white person acts black. Right, the way if they dress different, anyway. So that's one way of thinking about it. Contact hypothesis, this one right here, I've already kind of talked about this idea, but this idea says is that the way that we think about racial groups, the way that we think about our race and other groups, is defined or influenced by how much time and the nature of those interactions. So when we have interacted with another racial group in cooperative ways and as equals, right? So a good example would be like maybe living in a dorm together, or probably the military is a good example. We tend to change the way that we think about different racial groups, right? If, on the other hand, as a white person, I am in a hierarchical position over people of color, that will simply reinforce my ideas about my prejudicial ideas about race, because in this system, as a white person, I have authority over, or I have superiority. Racial formation theory is an interesting example. So this is kind of racial formation. A good example of racial formation theory is that during slavery, if you had 1 ounce of, or if you had 1 drop of black blood, you were considered a slave. Well, now it's kind of in reverse. There's a story that I put in this Canvas shell in this module about how there's a move, and I forget, I think it's Louisiana. They're trying to change the definition of race because it influences, I think, access to political processes. So, um, under some situations, there's more advantage to defining people as black in these examples. In other situations, there's more advantage to, I think in the example in the radio story that I put, it advantages white people to define more people as white. Under the under the time of slavery, it would advantage white people to define more people as black. So again, who is the group that's trying to define what racial group you belong to? It's the white people, right? So that speaks to conflict theory. That's really what racial formation theory says. And a really good example of racial formation theory is the census. Every time the census has been done, there have been different categories of racial group. That would, like that picture at the beginning of this chapter, who all had the different labels, right? The census is done by the government, and every time the census is done, the government thinks of different ways of categorizing people. So I'm forced to put myself as a person of color. If I'm forced to put myself in a category, the categories that I have to choose from are not defined by me, but they're defined by somebody else. So someone else, powerful people, are defining the categories, the options that I have to define myself. All right, here's another theory. This one is in the OpenStax, but is not in the Hensland book, Intersection Theory. So there's a notion in social science called intersectionality. And what intersectionality says is that really you can't separate any element of our social location. You can't separate my experience as a woman from my experience as a white person. You can't separate my experience as a white woman from my experience as a poor person. So really, we can't talk about race exclusively because it has overlaps with many of these other things. And this wheel here, I think the idea is that some of these you can change and some of them you can't. So the inner circle, right? The inner circle, your national origin, your age, your gender. Okay, so it's not a perfect example. You can't change some of these, but you can change the. So that's not a very good one. I should have found anyway. But so the notion is that experiences of race can't be separated from others. And the examples I have are a poor black woman has a different experience than a wealthy Asian man, or a disabled, poor, gay, white man has a different experience than the black female CEO. So, right, as the poor black woman's experiences because she's poor, because she's black? Is the Asian man's experiences because he's Asian or because he's male? Is the disabled, poor, gay, white guy, right, he's going to have a different experience because he's disabled or because he's gay or because he's poor? Right? And how is his experience different than, say, the disabled, poor, gay, black man's experience? Another example of this may be a little outdated, was when Barack Obama was running for president and he was sometimes accused of not being black enough. I kind of thought that. I remember thinking that, how can he relate to the poor black man in, I don't know, in Louisiana, right? So that's what I was thinking. And I heard him say one time, he says, when I hail a taxi cab in Chicago, I'm just as black as everybody else. And I was like, all right, it sort of made me think about, but that's really, that's the idea of intersectionality, is that race is just one component of all of these other sort of variables. All right, I'm going to stop here, and when I come back, it should be the very last one. Okay.